Sunday, May 13th, 1917. World War I was raging in Europe, and three shepherd kids, Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta, were tending their flocks near the small Portuguese town of Fatima, when suddenly they claimed to see a beautiful woman, more brilliant than the sun, made of light, holding a rosary in her hand. They believed they were seeing the Virgin Mary herself. Among other things, Mary urged them to recite the rosary every day, warned them that they would need to suffer for the conversion of sinners, and instructed them to come back to the exact same spot on the 13th of each month for the next 6 months. Which they did, and with each visit, more and more villagers followed. By the 13th of July, September, and October, the crowds had swelled so much that the child visionaries had trouble reaching the same spot that Mary had first appeared. By now, some villagers had already identified the three kids as saints, kneeling before them, asking for healing or the safe return of their loved ones from the Great War. Then, on October 13th, an estimated 70,000 people gathered for what was to be the Virgin's final visit. Lucia had asked for a miracle so that all might believe. The day began with heavy rain, but as the hour approached, witnesses recalled her shouting, "Be quiet, Our Lady is coming." The rain stopped, the clouds parted, and Lucia cried, "Look at the sun." According to a number of reports, some even coming from professional journalists, most of the crowd saw some sort of solar phenomenon. Reports described the sun trembling and dancing, casting waves of colored light over the fields. Some said they saw the Virgin's face, others described the sun spinning like a wheel and plunging toward the earth. Reports soon appeared in Portuguese newspapers claiming that the phenomena were witnessed not only at the site, but also by people as far as 40 kilometers away. Scholars and skeptics over the decades have offered various naturalistic explanations for the so-called miracle of the sun: unusual weather conditions, retinal effects from staring directly at the sun for too long, or even what social psychologists of religion might describe as the power of collective effervescence. When a large group of people, primed by anticipation and shared belief, report extraordinary perceptions during moments of intense religious ritual and emotion. Yet for the tens of thousands who stood in that field, and for the millions who have since made pilgrimage to Fatima, the event remains what the children first said it was: a Marian apparition. In her classic analysis of Marian apparitions, the scholar Sandra Zimdar-Swartz defines an apparition as a specific kind of vision in which a person or being not normally within the visionary's perceptual range appears to that person, not in a world apart as in a dream, and not as a modification of a concrete object as is the case of a weeping icon or moving statue, but as part of the environment, without apparent connection to verifiable visual stimuli. That's a lot, so let's break it down. First, an apparition involves a figure outside the normal range of perception, someone or something that the visionary would not ordinarily see. Second, it's not like dreaming. The figure appears during waking life, often vividly, though some experiences do involve trance-like states or altered states of consciousness. Third, the apparition is not just a change in an existing object. This sets apparitions apart from other kinds of visions that are very common across the different branches of Christianity, like when statues or icons are believed to bleed, move, or ooze oil. This also rules out seeing Mary or Jesus in an object or piece of food.
But how about the Virgin Mary in some salsa?
Finally, and most crucially, there's no clear physical cause. There's no projector hidden in the bushes. No lights, no tricks, at least not any that can be verified. The figure simply appears, unaccounted for by the normal laws of vision or physics. Now, to be clear, I'm not here to try to debunk these experiences. That's not the point of this video. On this channel, I do examine religion from a naturalistic perspective, but that does not mean we're out to prove or disprove anyone's vision. Instead, we're interested in how these stories are told, how they're received, and what they can tell us about the broader religious, cultural, or political worlds in which they happen. Thousands of people have reported seeing the Virgin Mary in this way. These Marian apparitions are mostly a Catholic phenomenon, but not exclusively. Other Christian traditions report their own encounters, such as the Coptic Orthodox Church. One of the most famous examples took place at St. Mary's Coptic Church in a suburb of Cairo called Zaytun. Between 1968 and 1970, crowds of people, including Christians and Muslims, claimed to see a glowing, luminous woman standing or gliding across the church's domes. Purported photos of the Zaytun apparitions are easy to find online, but they're messy evidence. Most are blurry or overexposed, many seem to be copies of newspaper pages, and the originals or negatives are not available for study. Skeptics over the years have criticized them, for example accusing the image that appears on Wikipedia of being an illustration superimposed onto a real photo. That said, to my knowledge, scholars have not conducted any forensic analyses of these photos. The only sustained scholarly eyewitness account we have comes from Dr. Cynthia Nelson, who was an anthropologist at the American University in Cairo at the time. She visited the church several times in 1968. One night she wrote, "When I looked to where the crowds were pointing, I too thought I saw a light through the branches of the trees, and as I tried to picture a nun-like figure in those branches, I could trace the outline of a figure. But as I thought to myself that this is just an illusion of the light reflecting through the branches, the image of the nun would leave my field of vision." On another visit, she reported intermittent flashes of light, and the crowd's response was electric. They clapped and shouted, "There she is, there she is." For her, the mystery was not whether people were experiencing something, they clearly were, but the question remains what that something actually was. She could not identify the source of the lights, though she noticed how quickly observers' expectations turned ambiguous lights into the Virgin herself. So from this we can see that Marian apparitions can be both public and private. Sometimes Mary is said to appear to a lone visionary with no one else around to confirm the experience. Other times the vision is shared, whether by a small group or a massive crowd, as was the case at Fatima or Zaytun. There's also a kind of middle ground case, where Mary is said to appear to a single visionary who alone sees and converses with her, but the encounter takes place in a public setting like during a prayer. In these examples, a seer sometimes has an ecstatic, trance-like experience in front of a group of people and transmits a spoken message to those around. Such was the case for Estela Ruiz, who was profiled in the book The Virgin of the Barrio by the scholar of religion Christy Nopon Warren. Ruiz experienced both personal apparitions and public, scheduled ones throughout the 1990s, which occurred monthly at a shrine she built in her backyard, purportedly at Mary's request. Another visionary, Maria Paula Acuna, sees Mary appear monthly in California's Mojave Desert, as chronicled by the scholar Lisa Patel in the book Our Lady of the Rock. But during the first 1,000 years of Christianity's history, the most commonly recorded apparitions were not of Mary. Reports usually described saints, angels, or other holy figures appearing to monks, nuns, or clergy, as in people who were already considered to be especially devout. But during the 11th and 12th centuries, reported sightings of Mary started to increase in Western Christianity. For example, in 1214, the Spanish priest Saint Dominic was said to have received a vision of the Virgin Mary. According to later tradition, Mary appeared to him holding a rosary and instructed him to use it as a tool for prayer and preaching, especially in his efforts to combat heresy in southern France. This story became foundational for the Dominican order, linking the rosary directly to Saint Dominic's mission and giving the practice a powerful origin story. The surge of Marian apparitions coincided with a broader boom in devotion to the Virgin Mary during the Middle Ages. St. Francis of Assisi is also said to have seen Mary atop a ladder reaching into heaven. Though with the notable exception of Our Lady of Guadalupe in 1531, which we'll examine later, reports of Marian apparitions dropped sharply after the medieval period. In fact, nearly 3 centuries separate Guadalupe from the next wave of major apparitions in the 19th century. Scholars aren't entirely sure why this drop-off happened. One possibility is that it was because of the fallout from the Protestant Reformation, when Catholic authority, including its claims of miracles and divine signs, were increasingly contested. But regardless, sightings of Mary came roaring back in the 19th and 20th centuries. Hundreds and hundreds were reported, not only in Europe, but around the world, including in Japan, Vietnam, Rwanda, Ecuador, and the US. One of the most famous apparitions took place in Lourdes, France, a town in the foothills of the Pyrenees Mountains. In 1858, a 14-year-old girl named Bernadette reported seeing the Virgin Mary. While she was gathering wood near a grotto, she saw a blinding white light and a figure she described as a lady wearing a white veil. Over the next few months, Bernadette reported 18 appearances of her. At one of these visitations, Mary instructed her to dig into the rocky ground of the grotto. Bernadette obeyed and scraped at the ground until she uncovered a small pool of muddy water. Witnesses describe her drinking from it and smearing some of the mud on her face, which she explained were directed by the Lady of the Vision. Later that same day, locals dug deeper into the spot and uncovered a flowing stream. Within days, people began taking bottles of the water back to Lourdes because they thought it had healing power, and within a few weeks, reports of miraculous cures were starting to circulate, and written accounts describe pilgrims arriving to the grotto to collect samples of the water. On the final appearance on March 25, 1858, Bernadette returned to the grotto. Only about 20 people were present that morning as she prayed the rosary and greeted the mysterious lady she had been seeing for weeks. Up until this point, Bernadette simply referred to the lady as that one, without claiming outright that it was Mary. But when Bernadette asked the woman to reveal her name, the figure replied, "I am the Immaculate Conception," which refers to the tradition of Mary's own conception in her mother Anne, when she was preserved from original sin from the very first moment of her existence. A local bishop declared the visions worthy of belief, and Lourdes became one of the most famous pilgrimage sites in the world, and Bernadette herself was canonized as a saint in 1933. And Lourdes was not an isolated case. In the span of about a century, a series of major apparitions captured Catholic imagination. Catherine Labouraire's vision in Paris in 1830, La Salette in 1846, Lourdes in 1858, Knock in Ireland in 1879, and Fatima in Portugal in 1917. There were also a pair of lesser-known but church-approved apparitions in Belgium in 1932 and 1933. Looking back, Pope Pius XII described the 1800s as the century of Marian predilection. One Catholic scholar has called the years 1830 to 1933 a golden age of apparitions. Others even refer to the period after 1830 as the Marian Age, because there was such a spike in Mary-focused devotion. But scholars of religion have noticed a big difference between the modern Marian apparitions and the medieval ones. First, modern apparitions often involved multiple appearances, sometimes even at scheduled times. Remember, at Fatima, the three kids reported that the Virgin Mary appeared to them on the 13th day of each month from May through October of 1917. Bernadette reported 18 visitations from Mary over the span of a few weeks. Scholars classify these as serial apparitions. Now, this is not entirely unique to the Marian Age. As we'll see, Juan Diego reported multiple encounters with the Virgin of Guadalupe in 1531, but the pattern became especially prominent in the 19th and 20th centuries, helping to build momentum around each site and drawing crowds of pilgrims. Second, modern apparitions generally visited non-clergy, including lay people who were not particularly religious or even appearing to non-Christians. And as we've already seen, many of the most famous Marian apparitions of the last 200 years came to kids, like the shepherd kids in La Salette, Bernadette in Lourdes, or Lucia and her cousins near Fatima. Then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, before he became Pope Benedict XVI, suggested that Mary appears to the young because their souls are not yet disturbed, and their interior powers of perception not yet dulled by the noise and concerns of adult life, making them more open to perceiving what he calls the deeper dimensions of reality. Though scholars of religion approach it differently, focusing on the social dynamics at play. The fact that modern Marian apparitions so often involve kids, laypeople, or marginalized figures highlights a fascinating interaction between individual experience and institutional authority. Anthropologists and sociologists of religion have long observed that visionary experiences across basically all religions can redistribute religious authority. A non-elite visionary can grant power and a public voice to people who otherwise lack official standing in a particular institution. When Mary is said to appear to someone without education, wealth, or clerical standing, the message to everyone else is pretty clear. Divine truth is not the monopoly of the elites. Instead, it can erupt into the lives of ordinary people. Few cases illustrate this more vividly than the 16th century apparition to Juan Diego in Mexico. In 1531, Mary is said to have appeared to an indigenous man named Juan Diego on Tepeyac Hill, outside of Tenochtitlan, what is now Mexico City. According to accounts compiled around a century later, she appeared as a young indigenous woman clothed in radiant light, speaking the native language Nahuatl, and told him to build a church for her there on that hill. Diego took the news back to the local bishop, but the bishop dismissed it and demanded proof. Mary then appeared to Diego 3 more times over the next few days. As a sign, she caused Castilian roses to bloom on the hilltop, flowers not native to Mexico and blooming out of season. Diego gathered them up into his tilma, a type of cloak traditionally worn by the indigenous peoples of central Mexico, and he carried them back to the bishop. When he opened the cloak, the roses spilled out, and imprinted on the inside was a miraculous image of the Virgin. At the same time, Diego's sick uncle reported his own vision of Mary, saying that she had healed him of his illness and instructed him to insist that a church be built in her honor under the name Guadalupe. Our Lady of Guadalupe has since become a national and religious symbol of Mexico. In 1895, the Pope gave the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe on Juan Diego's cloak a canonical coronation, which is an official declaration that an image of the divine is worthy of veneration, and Diego himself was canonized as a saint in 2002. According to the scholar Timothy Montavina, the Guadalupe Basilica in Mexico City is the most visited pilgrimage site in North America, and her image is the second most reproduced sacred image in the Western Hemisphere, behind only Jesus himself. The story of Juan Diego also foreshadows something we see in later Marian apparitions. Like Bernadette at Lourdes, he was not a member of the clergy, but someone humble and socially marginalized. Both visionaries were initially dismissed and required tangible evidence to be taken seriously, and both embodied the theme of Mary choosing those without status or power as her messengers. Now, as I mentioned, scholars of religion have argued that Marian apparitions shake up the clear institutionalized power structure of the church, giving a disadvantaged, uneducated person the opportunity to speak for a divine voice. As the scholar Agnieszka Halemba writes, the very claim of the visionaries to converse with a messenger of God directly can be seen as a way to bypass the church authority and monopoly. Though clearly this is a bit of a paradox because the church ultimately makes the decision of whether to grant legitimacy to an apparition. The Guadalupe story is tricky in this respect. The earliest written accounts of Juan Diego's vision only appear more than a century after the events, in devotional texts produced by Catholic priests. The main sources of the story were published in 1648, 1649, and 1675, respectively. This means we're looking at the story through sources already shaped by colonial and missionary interests. Some historians have argued that framing the apparition around a humble indigenous convert served the colonial church's agenda, presenting Catholicism as validated by indigenous experience while simultaneously subordinating indigenous symbols and sacred spaces to the Virgin Mary. That point becomes even sharper when we consider that the hill of Tepeyac, where Juan Diego purportedly met Mary, may have already been a site dedicated to a local goddess. Some scholars suggest that the apparition story helped redirect indigenous devotion from that goddess to the Virgin Mary. In this sense, Guadalupe could function both as a source of empowerment for indigenous believers, giving them a figure who spoke their language and appeared on their land, and as a tool of colonization, folding local religiosity into the authority of the Catholic Church. The art historian Jeanette Favreau-Peterson makes this point in her aptly named article, The Virgin of Guadalupe, Symbol of Conquest or Liberation. She argues in colonial Mexico, the Virgin of Guadalupe was continually reinterpreted by the ruling powers whenever political institutions were in flux. At times, she symbolized liberation, at other times, accommodation and control. Her image served elites as much as it served indigenous believers. In short, she embodied both conquest and liberation, simultaneously sanctioning colonial hierarchies while at the same time offering a figure through whom ordinary people could imagine divine solidarity. Overall, the Guadalupe story shows how apparitions can carry deep social weight, with ordinary people spontaneously becoming visionaries, being accepted by the people. But ultimately, the church decides what's legitimate. This brings us to the theological framework the Catholic Church uses to authorize apparitions. From a Catholic theological standpoint, Marian apparitions are categorized as private revelations. This sets them apart from public revelation, which refers to God's act of revealing himself to humanity, which finds its literary expression in the Old and New Testaments. Public revelation is understood to have unfolded gradually, and it's also considered completed. Nothing can be added to it. What continues to develop over time is the Church's understanding of the public revelation, through study, prayer, and the teaching authority of the Church. This distinction is laid out clearly in the Message of Fatima, a document authored in 2000 under Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI. He explains how the Fatima apparitions fit within Catholic teaching on revelation. In his words, the authority of private revelations is essentially different from that of the definitive public revelation. Private revelation is a help to this faith, and shows its credibility by leading one back to the definitive public revelation. In other words, no apparition, no matter how celebrated, adds new doctrine to the faith. Even approved apparitions are never binding articles of faith. A Catholic can fully practice the faith without believing the apparitions of Lourdes, Fatima, or Guadalupe. At the same time, the Church may recognize certain apparitions as worthy of belief, acknowledging their role in inspiring devotion. As the Catechism of the Catholic Church puts it, apparitions or private revelations, some of which have been recognized by the authority of the Church, their role is not to improve or complete Christ's definitive revelation, but to live more fully by it in a certain period of history. So how does the Church decide whether an apparition is worthy of belief? The Catholic Church approaches these claims with caution and a structured process. In 1978, the Vatican issued official guidelines to help bishops discern reports of apparitions. And the investigation is often lengthy and can sometimes stretch across years or even decades. Most of the time, the responsibility first falls to the local bishop of the diocese where the apparition is reported. The bishop may convene a commission of experts, theologians, canon lawyers, psychologists, and medical doctors. Together, they examine a few things: the character of the visionary, their psychological health, the content of the reported message to make sure nothing contradicts Catholic faith or morals, and the fruit of the apparition. So basically, whether it's inspiring true devotion and leads to conversions or even producing healings or miracles. Eyewitnesses are interviewed at length, and any supposed miracles are carefully documented. At the end of the process, the bishop has three options. He can declare constat de supernaturalitate, that the apparition is of supernatural origin, and therefore worthy of belief. Or he can rule constat de non supernaturalitate, as in definitely not supernatural, whether it's a hoax, a mistake, or just some natural phenomenon being misinterpreted. But the most common verdict is actually the middle ground. Non constat, meaning that the case is not confirmed as supernatural, but it's not ruled out either. The Church essentially takes a wait-and-see approach. If an apparition, though, is judged authentic, it gets formally approved as worthy of belief. That means that Catholics are free to believe it and to take part in devotions connected to it. If it's judged false, though, the church will forbid public devotion at the site and warn the faithful to stay away. But even when the apparition is approved, it's never elevated to dogma. As Pope Benedict XVI explained, approval simply means the message contains nothing contrary to faith, and it may actually help people grow in the faith. But the vast majority of apparitions reported over the past 2 centuries have not even been investigated by the church at all, and it seems unlikely that they're high on any bishop's priority list. In a sense, though, that silence is itself a message. By doing nothing, the church avoids endorsing potentially controversial visions while letting popular devotion quietly continue on its own. Out of hundreds of Marian apparition claims, only a small number have earned official recognition. According to America magazine, in the past century alone, more than 1,500 alleged visions of Mary were reported worldwide, but fewer than 20 have been officially recognized as genuine. The major approved apparitions are well known: Guadalupe, Lourdes, Fatima, each with their own extensive church-endorsed devotions and even basilicas. But others have been explicitly rejected. For example, take the case of Gianna Talone Sullivan in Emmitsburg, Maryland. Beginning in the 1990s, she claimed to receive daily messages from the Virgin Mary, including one public message every Thursday night during prayer services at a parish near Baltimore. The gatherings grew rapidly, attracting several hundred people every week. At these events, Sullivan would go into prayer, announce that she had received a new message from Mary, and then have it read aloud to those present. In September 2000, after a lengthy investigation, the Archdiocese of Baltimore formally ruled against her claims. Church authorities met with Sullivan and announced that they found no basis for the alleged apparitions. They ordered the Thursday night prayer meetings to be discontinued, and they banned the promotion of Sullivan's messages, including a video titled "Unbridled Mercy" that was circulating among her followers. Whether or not an apparition is accepted as credible depends a lot on what Mary is purported to say. Sometimes she's silent, but other stories describe her as giving messages. When Mary appeared in 1846 to 2 shepherd kids on the mountainside in La Salette, France, she was said to have told them that her son was angry that people were forsaking the Sabbath, not attending Mass, and not praying regularly. She also told the kids to pray and to say Our Father and Hail Mary at least twice daily, as well as to tell their employers. As you can see, Mary can be quite specific in her wishes. In the case of Emmitsburg, Maryland, though, the Archdiocese of Baltimore explained that some of her messages included apocalyptic predictions and theological claims that could not be reconciled with Catholic teaching. This episode illustrates that the Church is willing to oppose apparition claims when they show signs of fraud, fanaticism, doctrinal error, or even psychological instability in the seer. They weigh evidence, interview witnesses, and perhaps most importantly, they watch what happens over time. They figure that true Marian apparitions should yield good fruit: deeper faith, moral conversion, and even miracles. What it should not produce is division or chaos. But Marian apparitions don't occur in a cultural vacuum. They often erupt at flashpoints of social and political tension, and the messages or imagery they carry usually reflect those contexts. Think of Guadalupe in 16th century Mexico. Mary's appearance to an indigenous man, speaking an indigenous language, on a former shrine to an indigenous goddess, must be understood in the context of the Spanish conquest and the subsequent campaigns of conversion and religious syncretism that was already underway. At Lourdes in 1858, the Virgin identified herself as the Immaculate Conception, just 4 years after Pope Pius IX had declared that doctrine dogma, making the apparition feel like divine confirmation of that teaching. The apparitions at Fatima in 1917 unfolded against the backdrop of World War I and fear of communism in Russia following the February Revolution of 1917 and Lenin's return to Russia in April of that year. According to Lucia, Mary delivered her most dramatic message on July 13, 1917. In memoirs written decades later, Lucia recalled that Mary specifically mentioned Russia. She claimed that Mary warned that if the world did not repent, Russia will spread her errors throughout the world, causing wars and persecutions of the Church. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me, and she will be converted, and a period of peace will be granted to the world. This shows that Marian apparitions reflect their social and political contexts, which brings us to one of the most unusual and controversial modern examples: the town of Medjugorje in what is now Bosnia-Herzegovina. Back in June of 1981, it was still part of Yugoslavia, and 6 kids ranging from the age of 10 to 16 started claiming almost daily appearances of the Virgin Mary. Now, unlike most Marian apparitions, which are relatively short-lived, the visions of Medjugorje did not stop after a few days or weeks. Some of the visionaries reported seeing Mary daily, and several claimed the apparitions continue to this day, more than 40 years later. The Medjugorje visions quickly developed their own distinctive features that scholars call Marian apocalypticism. According to the visionaries, the Virgin of Medjugorje often calls herself the Queen of Peace, and she often appeared in tears, pleading for humanity and warning about the state of the world. The visionaries also spoke of receiving secrets. 10 secrets revealed respectively to each visionary that touched not only on their personal lives, but also the fate of the church and the entire world. These secrets are still only partially revealed and have fueled speculation about coming trials and apocalyptic punishments, and devotees are convinced that some global catastrophes could be delayed or softened through prayer. One of the seers, Mirjana Dragachevich, has hinted that one of these hidden messages spoke of a global danger that was ultimately avoided because of the fasting and prayers of the faithful. Many followers have interpreted her words as a reference to the Cold War, the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, and the breakup of Yugoslavia. So again, like other Marian apparitions, some of the visions at Medjugorje reflect the social and political reality of the time. But Medjugorje also shows how complicated the road to recognition can be. Unlike other apparitions which gained church approval within a few years, Medjugorje remained in limbo for more than 40 years. Local bishops long doubted the visionaries' claims, and even Pope Francis himself in 2017 joked that he preferred Mary as a mother and not a telegraph operator, sending out daily messages. Some Vatican investigators even suggested the phenomenon was deceptive rather than divine. And yet, the devotion kept growing. Millions of pilgrims continued to climb Apparition Hill, attend Mass at St. James Church, and join in prayer vigils. By some counts, Mary has allegedly appeared more than 40,000 times since 1981, and according to site statistics, 1.7 million communion wafers were distributed in a single year, which I guess is one way to get an official headcount. Then in September 2024, the Vatican finally gave a cautious green light, issuing a nihil obstat, literally, no objection. Now, to be clear, this does not mean the Vatican suddenly declared Our Lady of Medjugorje as authentic. What it did say was that people are now free to go there, pray, and treat it as a place of devotion. Their decision was largely based on what they considered were abundant and widespread fruits of the visions. Couples patching up their marriages, reports of healings, new charities for the poor being founded, etc., etc. So the church essentially said, we're not vouching for every message that these seers are claiming to receive, but we can't deny the devotion here is bearing fruit. This long road to partial recognition illustrates again the tensions that apparitions can reveal between the laity and the clergy, the charismatic authority of a visionary versus the institutional authority of the church. The survival of an apparition site often depends less on official pronouncements than on the devotion of the faithful. In fact, scholars like Peter Jan Margry point out that the number of claimed apparitions has exploded in recent decades, but especially since the mid-1900s, this growing wave of visions have come from believers who are not aligned with the Catholic Church's teachings or its modern practices. These modern apparitions and their followings function as vehicles for alternative religious voices, ways of imagining Mary as an intercessor but outside of the official channels of the church. And while many of these non-mainstream revelatory Marian movements never gain official recognition, their impact is very real. Once an apparition is broadly accepted, even informally, it can spark an entire movement of popular piety and create major pilgrimage destinations. Medjugorje is the clearest example. Whatever the Vatican's hesitations, the apparitions there fueled a devotional culture throughout the 1980s and 1990s. A culture that transformed a poor Yugoslav farming village into a hub of global Catholic tourism. Hotels, restaurants, travel agencies, and entire industries sprang up to serve the millions of pilgrims who come seeking peace, healing, or a personal encounter with Mary. Today, the towns of Lourdes and Fatima also attract several million pilgrims each year, which has literally reshaped these once remote villages. Lourdes today is a town of only 15,000 residents, but it hosts 5 to 6 million visitors each year, second only to Paris when it comes to hotel capacity in France. The local economy revolves almost entirely around religious tourism, generating an estimated 300 million euros each year. In Fatima, on the major anniversary dates of May 13th and October 13th, up to 1 million people gather to pray, an astonishing number that transforms the landscape into a sea of candlelight. And church leaders sometimes worry about these so-called pilgrimage economies overshadowing more lofty goals. The Vatican's caution with Medjugorje was partly because the ongoing visions coincided with thriving commerce, raising the cynical question, if the apparitions stopped, would the visitors and income stop too? Yet historically, sacred pilgrimage sites have always given rise to local economies that can stick around for centuries. So the legacy of Marian apparitions is vast. They leave physical legacies like basilicas, shrines, hospitals, and tourist economies, as well as intangible legacies like devotional practices and cultural symbols. They also continually pose a challenge, the tension between folk practice and institutional authority, which sometimes yields interesting results when the church finds an apparition legitimate. Mary may appear to a little girl, but then popes and bishops come as pilgrims to bow at the spot. In 1982, Pope John Paul II traveled to Fatima to thank Mary after surviving an assassin's bullet, a bullet which now is ensconced in the crown of the Fatima statue. And even Pope Francis, while famously skeptical of those Medjugorje visions, went to Marian shrines and spoke of Mary as a mother who runs to meet us in our needs. So apparitions have entered the highest echelons of devotion while still remaining essentially a grassroots phenomenon. Though Marian apparitions can look very different depending on who's telling the story, and the same is true about today's news cycle. That's why I use today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that lets you compare how thousands of news outlets across the political spectrum are covering the same story. If you're frustrated by echo chambers or just want to understand how different communities are reacting to the headlines, Ground News makes it easy. You can scroll through a single story and instantly see the political bias of the sources reporting, as well as who owns the different outlets and their factuality ratings. For example, here's one of today's stories on Ground News. President Trump is filing a $15 billion defamation case against the New York Times. Over here, Ground News has aggregated hundreds of sources reporting on the story. Scroll down and can see the biased distribution chart. This shows that coverage is fairly evenly split across left, right, and center, though slightly less coverage is coming from the right. Scroll down again and you can see that the majority of these sources are rated as highly factual. And here we have the ownership chart that shows a big chunk of these sources are owned by media conglomerates, followed by wealthy private owners and independent sources. Ground News also enables you to easily compare the headlines to see how each side is framing the story. On the left, Raw Story includes a quote from one of the lawyers they interviewed. Trump makes midnight announcement of stunningly pathological $15 billion lawsuit. Meanwhile, on the right, Breitbart highlights Trump's own words. Trump launches $15 billion lawsuit against New York Times, allowed to freely lie, smear, and defame me. Same event, completely different framing, and Ground News lays it all out for you side by side, so instead of bouncing between apps or scrolling endlessly on social media, you can see the full picture in one place. I've been using Ground News for a while now, and I love how it helps me break out of my media bubble and understand bigger conversations happening around any major headline. So if you want to be a more informed news consumer, check out Ground News today. Head to ground.news/religion for breakfast or click the link in the description below to get 40% off their Vantage plan. Again, that's ground.news/religion for breakfast. Thanks, everyone.